Let's become stabilized and focused on Jesus. John 1, 1 through 5. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him. Without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shineth in the darkness, but the darkness comprehended it not. And in John 1, verse 14, it says, And the Word was made flesh, and dwelt among us. And we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. Well, let's think for a moment about the idolatry Israel fell into in the wilderness. Paul writes to the church at Corinth in 1 Corinthians 10, 1 through 6. There he relates to them the experience at the Red Sea. And in verse 3 he says, And they did all eat of the same spiritual food, and did all drink of the same spiritual drink. For they drank of the spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. And in verse 5 he says that many of them he was not well pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. If they were overthrown, that means that they were fighting God. In spite of all the evidence, all the direct evidence that the Lord had taken them out of slavery and was with them and leading them, they continued to complain, which shows the seriousness of their sin. It also tells us here that what happened was written for our admonition as an example, so that we should not lust after the evil that they did. So the Scripture's clear who was with Israel, and he was there constantly, vigilantly, faithfully. But did they know him? Obviously, apparently not, but a few in Old Testament history. We can think of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Moses, Elijah, Elisha, and the other true prophets, King Josiah, and before them the godly Enoch, and of course Noah, and many others, but definitely a minority of the multitudes of people. And yet these few were sinners, because all flesh has sinned. Now this should give us encouragement, because we too are sinners. What about David, that shepherd, and later the king of Israel? Did he know that spiritual rock? Let's take a look. We know that Saul was the first king of Israel, and we see in 1 Samuel 17, verse 1, that the Philistines had came to harass Saul's army. And they were camped on Judean territory and ready for battle. Now we want to introduce David. He was the youngest son of Jesse. David, a nobody really, a humble shepherd. He was a musician, and but the least of the household of the aged Jesse. Now David's three oldest brothers were prominent and respected members of King Saul's army. One day, David's father Jesse said to David, "Go up to the army encampment and take grain and bread to your brothers, and take cheeses to the captain of thousands, and find out how your brothers are doing, and return and let me know." So David made preparations, and he left. And as he came into the camp, Goliath, who stood over 9 feet tall, he was taunting Israel's army, taunting the God of Israel, and saying, "Send a man over here to fight with me. And if you kill me, we will be your servants. But if I kill him, you will be our servants." But Saul's men were intimidated, and they all ran away from him. Now when David heard this, he said, "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that should defy the armies of the living God?" This wasn't a question, this was an exclamation. David wanted to defend God's honor, his name, and his character. Now, he had just been told what the reward would be for the man who killed Goliath. Saul would extend his daughter's hand in marriage, and also that man's family would never pay taxes. Now, it was a huge deal to be a member of the king's family, but by David's actions and his words, he never focused on that reward. In fact, he didn't claim it till years later. So here's David, indignant by what the giant is saying and why king's army isn't doing something about it. After being berated by his oldest brother and accused of only coming to the army camp to watch the fighting, he says, "What have I done now? Is there not a cause?" And all the rest of the men also spoke to him in the same way. So at that moment, most people would have said, "If that's the way you feel about it, I'm going to go home and take care of my father's sheep." But not David. He was jealous of God's name, and he had a vision of God's plan and his cause. He had God's best interest at heart. David went and said to Saul in verse 32, "Let no man's heart fail him because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." What gave David such courage in the face of Goliath and the attitude of the men towards him? This is revealed in his reply to Saul, who tried to discourage him because of his lack of experience and his young age. So David related to Saul how he had saved his father's sheep when they were attacked by a lion and a bear, and that he had killed them with his hands, and that this Philistine would be just like them. He convinced Saul, he gave him the go-ahead, even gave him his own armor. But David said, "This has not been tried, this has not been tested," and so he didn't want it. He didn't wear it. In verses 5 through 7 there of 1 Samuel 17, it says that Goliath's armor and helmet were of bronze and his spear of iron. I have to be very careful here, but who really cares what Goliath's armor was made of? And who cares which wild animals attacked David's sheep? And yet the details are recorded. And furthermore, can a man kill a wild lion and a wild bear? Of course not. David's complete trust in God enabled the slaying of these animals. But let's take a close look at these details that God included in this narrative. Take the lion. Now, this quarter on the front page of our quarterly is a picture of the striding lion on the wall of Babylon along the processional way. And of course, Daniel was in the lion's den. And in chapter 7 of Daniel's dream of the four beasts, representing the four kingdoms, the lion was Babylon and the bear was Medo-Persia. Okay, stay with me now. The challenge before David now was to somehow penetrate Goliath's bronze armor and escape the iron spear. These medals represent the other two kingdoms of Greece and Rome. Now, all of these kingdoms were humanistic kingdoms. They were man-based, not God-based, and they depended on human ingenuity, worldly power, and the expansionistic desires of human kings. So whether or not these animals and these medals were included in this narrative for the purpose of symbolism, one thing is clear. David did not believe in humanism, but depended totally on God to fight for his father's sheep and to defend God's honor against the Philistines. Now we know the story. David, he slung the stone and went through a space this big in Goliath's helmet, sunk in his skull, and Goliath died. This is a feat mathematically impossible by human standards. By faith and the power of God, David became God's weapon. Now, David's later sins demonstrate he was but flesh, pampered, spoiled by success as king. He fell into temptation. And the old adage is true. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Does this mean, actually when Nathan, the prophet, came to him and told him of his sins, revealed his sins to him, he was, with humility, accepted counsel, and he humiliated himself before the Lord. Now, does this mean that he had it easy from there on? No, he didn't. He had to deal with the results of his sins, but he did it with the Lord at his side. David wrote in Psalms 19, verse 7, "The law of the Lord is perfect, converting the soul." And later Luke relates the Lord's words in Acts 13:22 in the last part. He says, "I have found David, the son of Jesse, a man after mine own heart, which shall fulfill all my will." Jesus was not ashamed to be called the Son of David. We talked about humanistic kingdoms. In our search for humanistic kingdoms, which is not hard to find, let's look for a moment at the unjust trial of Christ by Pilate. In Matthew 27, verses 17, 20, and 21, it says, "When they were gathered together, Pilate said unto them, Whom shall I release to you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called Christ? But the chief priests and elders persuaded the multitude that they should ask for Barabbas and destroy Jesus." In the book Desire of Ages, page 733, it says that Barabbas thought he was entitled to all that he took, and that he claimed to be the Messiah, and under cover of religion committed the sin of robberies and many other sins. But the crowd then said, "Give us Barabbas." You see, he had their hearts. He appealed to their worldly, carnal nature. He was a folk hero and supported by many people. Now in John 19, verse 15, Pilate also said this, "Behold your king. Shall I crucify your king?" And the chief priest said, "We have no king but Caesar." And these two combined, Barabbas and Caesar, sum up the characteristics of humanism, that belief that is against the Creator God. It is for worldly power, an entitlement to those things that belong only to God. That's what humanism is. It wants to grab those things that belong only to God. Historically, only one power inherited the throne of Caesar. And as you may have heard, this power is today promoting a new humanism. This is the power that is the composite beast power of Revelation 13, 1 and 2. It has all the characteristics of the four kingdoms. Now, Scripture tells us there's nothing new under the sun. So this new humanism that is being promoted is nothing more than the old humanism of Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. In Revelation 18:23, in the last part, here speaking of the church-state power called Babylon, it says, "For thy merchants were the great men of the earth, for by thy sorceries were all nations deceived." Now our prayer is that we may not be lured in by the words of these merchants. That's those who are selling this humanism. Those global religious leaders, many very famous names, political leaders, the global experts in all learning and science, and also our favorite celebrities. And may we not be drawn in by the miracles and the signs of the wonders that are in the world today and are invading the churches. The Bible calls them the doctrines of devils working miracles. There's a very popular morning TV talk and information show that regularly features spirit mediums. And of course, they're selling the idea that when you die, you don't die, you go to the other side, and that you can communicate with your relatives. This last one that I saw, she had a book out called Signs. Well, we have a book out called the Holy Bible that has a more sure word of prophecy that tells us of signs which are true. And their signs may be the same signs, but they mean different things. Now back to David. David had already conquered the giant that faced him, threatened him. He had conquered the fear of the lion and the bear before he encountered the giant, because he knew the battle and the victory was the Lord's. What about ourselves? Let's look at ourselves. Have we conquered the fear of that woman or that man behind the door we should be knocking on? Right, Malcolm? Or the fear of speaking up for the Lord when His name is being smeared? Or the fear that we don't know enough to give a Bible study, even a little one? Do we have this vision of that heavenly kingdom and of the earth made new? Do we have that vision of a face-to-face communication with the Lord? Does this lead us to action? Have we given over the battle against self to the Lord? If we have, then the words and power of the giant Babylon, that church-state power, you know, Sunday laws, persecution, a worthless credit card, these will seem no different because we have learned that the battle and the victory is the Lord's. So maybe we should be like David against Goliath and act, but trust only in the power of God. In 1 Samuel 17:32, Darren read, and David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail him. Because of him, your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." Our prayer today is that no child, no young adult, no middle-aged person, or no old folks' hearts will fail because of him. And each one of us will say, "Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine."